My name is Carolyn, and I am a recovered compulsive eater. So I will try to move chronologically. I started compulsively eating as a child. And of course, this is a progressive illness. So, I didn't start going crazy and binging and purging and all of that as a 7-year old, but I did start really obsessing about food and also using food for ease and comfort as a reward to escape from boredom. So I did start using food in those types of ways as a very young kid, about a 6 or 7 year old. So I would do things like overeat, take food off of my siblings' plates. I definitely thought a lot about food and was sort of overly excited to eat and to eat certain things. I definitely, as a kid, used food as a sort of sense of a reward, after a day at school, or maybe, there was something that I didn't want to do. I was, kind of using food as sort of like, okay, I'll get through this and then I'll be able to eat, this treat or that food or whatever. I also definitely thought about food a lot more than other children. For example, I'd be going over to a friend's house to play. And, obviously that child is thinking about, what toys are we going to play? What games are we going to play with? And I was thinking about, like, when are we going to eat and what kind of snacks are they going to have? And I remember just being absolutely amazed at the kinds of foods that my friends were able to keep in their pantries at home. Because at my house, we were not able to keep any kind of goodie or snack or junk food or anything like that because I would just eat it all. Now, both of my parents do have problems with compulsive eating. Obviously, I'm not going to diagnose them one way or the other, but they do have issues with compulsive eating. And so my parents, both of them would say things like, well, we can't have that in house. We can't keep that in house, implying that they would eat it. But it was absolutely true for me as well that, when they would buy certain things at the grocery store that maybe they didn't really like, they didn't feel very tempted by, let's say there's 12 little individual baggies in a package. Well, I would go through all 12 of those individual snack sized bags or whatever, the same day that they came back from the grocery store. And I remember them saying, like, we can't keep this in the house. Like, just have one. Let's try to make this last a couple of days, And so just seeing that other kids could have, cookies, candy, snacks, whatever, and not be tearing through it, that it could actually stay in their home really kind of made me think at a very young age, okay, something is different here with the way that I am eating. So, as I got older, as I became more of like a preteen, I started gaining weight. My metabolism slowed down, whatever. Maybe I wasn't being as active. And people started to take notice of that. Adults in my life began to make comments, not necessarily terrible comments or anything, but just kind of taking note that, I'm gaining weight and I'm, maybe not as healthy as the typical kid. I remember my parents, having discussions, thinking they were out of earshot about, curbing my snacking and what can we do there. And I began to experience some bullying about my weight. So that kind of added on another layer. And, if I wasn't a compulsive eater and I was just a kid who had developed some bad habits around food, then the shame that I felt and the bullying that I started to experience, and it wasn't anything crazy. I was very fortunate in that way. But if I was just a kid who had some bad habits, then those consequences would have been enough, and I would have changed my eating habits. But because I am a chronic compulsive eater, these consequences that I started to experience, the physical consequences and also the emotional consequences of feeling bad about myself, feeling ashamed, feeling embarrassed, experiencing, kids making mention of my weight, etc. That just drove me more into compulsive eating. And so I started being very dishonest about my eating, and I would hide food and I would sneak food. And, I just remember sneaking into the kitchen when I thought that my parents were asleep, or sneaking into, another area of the house when we're at a family party or something. I remember hiding food in my bedroom to eat later, and taking these risks of being caught and being really humiliated, knowing that I was not supposed to be doing this stuff, and just feeling, even at such a young age, feeling really powerless over my behavior. Like, I don't want to be doing this. What is wrong with me? Here I am sneaking around in the kitchen, trying desperately not to make a sound, opening the packages so that they don't make noise, etc. Just feeling like I couldn't help it. Moving into my teenage years, I was definitely just a straight up binge eater. I was really binging a lot and eating massive quantities of food and making myself feel sick. As a teen, I developed a real obsession with what I looked like and wanting to be very, very thin. That was just like my whole goal in life. And for whatever reason, everyone's different, but I was dancing a lot. I was doing ballet, and just the way that I was built, I wasn't really experiencing a lot of bad consequences. I'd kind of like had a growth spurt. And so I was, physically, doing fine. I was binge eating, but I was not overweight at all. The only reason why I bring that up is because, I think a lot of times people have, myself included, when I was stuck in my illness, we have this correlation between, weight and emotional well-being and physical health. I want to bring up my weight because I started compulsively eating as a young child, and then I did not get recovered until I was in my late 20s. And over the course of that time, I was all different weights. There were times when I was very, very thin. There were times when I was slightly overweight. There were times when I was overweight. There was times when I was obese, and everything in between. And I remember thinking, when I am thin, I feel better and I'm happy and I'm confident. And that was such a lie that I was telling myself, because it did not matter what my body looked like and what weight I was, because even when I was thin, I was miserable. I did not feel good. I was not happy. And I was still compulsively eating. I was just managing it in a different way. So I just want to point that out because, as a teenager, I was so obsessed with being thin, and I was thin, and I was, I had a healthy body, which, as I get older, I'm just so incredibly thankful for that. But, as a teenager, it's like I just wanted it to be a certain way. And I thought that if I was really thin, I would be happy. But like that was just a total lie, because over the course of the decades when I was a compulsive eater and I was up and down in all different sizes, I was always miserable. And like I said, I was always compulsively eating. And again, I think that's really a misconception. I was binge eating even when I was quote unquote in a healthy body or thin. And that leads me into another point that I want to bring up. I could compulsively eat. I could binge on anything. And so there were times time periods in my life when I would binge on, foods that I had told myself were bad, that I had labeled in my mind, these are bad for you foods. And I would binge on those. Um, Sweet, salty, all different kinds. It wasn't one specific thing. It was just all different kinds of foods, right? And of course, in my mind, there are certain foods that, like, if I eat them, it's horrible, it's wrong, and I would binge on those foods. However, I would also binge on really healthy food, raw fruits and vegetables, cottage cheese, diet food. I would binge on those foods as well. I would also binge on foods that I didn't even like. And I think that is something that I always kind of felt, until I was lucky enough to find CCEA, I felt like people didn't really understand, because saying like, well, just don't eat this, don't eat that, or you need to eat this in moderation, or, don't eat that kind of food, or don't eat that ingredient. Write down your trigger foods. I just was always kind of like smiling and nodding, but I just thought to myself, like, that doesn't make sense to me, because I will just binge on whatever is available to me. I mean, I remember binging once on uncooked pasta because that's just what happened to be in the house. So as a teenager, all I cared about was being thin. And of course, by this point, as I said, I'm a full-blown binge eater. So now I have a real problem because I'm using food for ease and comfort. I love the way it feels to binge. It's a total habit. I feel like I can't live without it. And also, all I care about is being thin. So I've got an issue. And so this time period in my life really solidified this pattern that I would continue with for the rest of my compulsive eating days. In the big book, they describe it as like this horrible cycle. And that's definitely how I felt, that I felt like I was just like stuck in this pattern that I just couldn't get out of. So basically, every day was a new day for me. I was like an eternal optimist. So I would wake up and I'd be like, today's a new day. And as soon as I wake up, I'm right away thinking about, what am I going to eat today? What is my exercising going to be? How am I going to stop myself from binging? What did I eat yesterday? How much can I eat? What kind of food can I eat? What kind of plan am I going to follow? I mean, those thoughts are just in my mind as soon as I wake up. And so what I would do is I would try to eat as little as possible for as long as I could. I would, pack my lunch for high school, and sometimes I could make it through the day just eating like this tiny amount of food that I brought for myself. But more often than not, I would buy food from the cafeteria, or I would borrow money from someone to buy food from the cafeteria if I hadn't brought money, or I would just eat my friends' leftovers from their lunches that they didn't want. So 9 times out of 10, couldn't make it throughout the day. And of course, once I've done that, once I've messed up, a lot of times I would just be like, well, today is over. Today is done. I might as well just go crazy. But let's say, maybe I could make it through the day of high school, white knuckling it, barely holding on, without eating the wrong thing, all these rules that I've set up for myself. I would get home and either like immediately I would just start binging because it's like, well, I've made it through the day, or sometimes I would kind of be like, okay, well, I'm just going to have like half of this for dinner. And then, it's like the classic, well, I'm just going to have a little bit. Okay, now I'm having the whole portion. Okay, now I'm having another portion. And then I'm just eating, eating, eating. And again, this could have been anything. Like sometimes I would eat, foods that were wrong for me. Other times I would eat like 10 packages of some kind of diet food or whatever. So it really didn't matter what the food was. For me, it was just about the feeling of compulsively eating, of eating, of being full. And I would eat so fast that, it's like I wasn't even really tasting it anyway. And so then this is the cycle, right? So then I'd be like, okay, well, I messed up today. And so I'll just start over tomorrow. And over the years, there were times when I could kind of go a couple of days without binging. There were definitely times when I could white knuckle it and I could stick with some kind of diet program or whatever for a couple of weeks. But I was always miserable, always obsessed. So it really didn't matter because my mind was still very, very sick. During this time in high school, a lot of things that would continue on for decades were really solidified. Another thing that I would do is I would, lie about where I was going, and I would just drive around and buy massive amounts of food and drive around and eat it in the car and then hide all the evidence, all the wrappers and whatever, and come home and, lie about where I had been. That was something that I did forever, driving around, eating in the car. I'm sure many of us can relate to that. I also started as a high schooler, I was working at like a preschool that was attached to a church. The church like had a big industrial kitchen, and in their giant freezer, they had all of these frozen baked goods for, I don't know, I assume the congregation, but they might have been for like a charity. Who knows? They weren't mine, they were for a church. And what I would do was I would make up some reason. Usually I said I was going to like clean the toys. I would go into the kitchen and I would just eat all of these frozen baked goods that belonged to a church. I mean, you can't get much lower than that. And I would be cutting my mouth on them because I wouldn't let them thaw. So I'm like scraping up my mouth. And again, it just really goes to show you like, I wasn't even really tasting the food. It was like I was just doing it. The reverse is true too. I would burn my mouth on food because I couldn't wait for it to cool down. So that was another habit of stealing food, taking food, whether it be from people that I was babysitting for, or from work, or from roommates. I remember I was like a server for these like fancy people would have these like very fancy holiday parties, and they would hire my sister and I to like walk around with like trays of hors d'oeuvres, and I would like put them in my pockets and like stand in a corner and like shovel in my mouth. I mean, I would, if we were at another function or a party, I would take food into the bathroom and eat it in the bathroom. So I was just really developing all of these really crazy habits that ended up lasting a really, really long time. Another thing that I kind of want to touch on is every milestone, every life event, I would connect to my eating. So like every birthday, I would say, to myself and to others, like, this is it. I'm really going to change. Like, I'm going to figure this out. When I graduated from high school and I went to college, it was like, okay, now I'm really going to turn my life around. Any kind of like winter break, spring break, summer break, any kind of thing like that, I would say to myself, like, okay, I'm going to, really change over summer break or spring break. I'm going to get my eating under control. And I would make a plan prior to the break or prior to the event, prior to the milestone. And I would do research and I'd be reading all these self-help books and magazines. And we didn't really have the internet really when I was a teenager, but there were lots of magazines were big things. I was always reading magazines about this diet and that diet and intuitive eating and all kinds of stuff. I was always talking about it with my friends. It was just like any kind of life event was tied to like me trying to get my eating under control. And of course, it never worked. I would spend weeks preparing for spring break or summer break or whatever, and nothing ever changed. I started seeing a therapist as a teenager for my eating problems. I specifically went to therapy for decades, and I was always there to work on my eating, however that looked. So like I would think, maybe I lack self-esteem, so I'm going to work on self-esteem or self-love or whatever. So I also started seeing a therapist as a teenager and carried that through, and I saw I never really stopped seeing some kind of therapist because, I did understand on some level that there's something really wrong with me and that I needed a therapist, but of course it never worked. As a young adult, college, so one thing that I tried in college was I came to the realization that, okay, I have to binge. Okay, I've tried everything to stop binging. I really can't imagine not doing that. So my new plan is, okay, I'm just going to binge once a day. And so in college, probably for the whole time, I just would eat nothing until 4 o'clock. And then I would go absolutely crazy and I would eat massive quantities of food around 4 o'clock. And more often than not, that would just continue into the night and I would just keep binging. But sometimes I could just handle that. So that was kind of my solution for a while. There's no way that I won't be able to binge. So let me just try to do it once a day. So I did that for a while. And, in terms of things that I tried to do to stop. I've already mentioned therapy. I tried hypnosis. I tried all different kinds of exercise programs, food journaling for sure, getting different hobbies, any kind of diet you can think of, juice cleanses. I tried those. I tried like MetaFast where you like kind of got like these powders and made them into like shakes and stuff. I did that. I did Weight Watchers many times. I started smoking. I became a smoker because I was thinking, well, I must just need some kind of like compulsive habit. And so I'll just do this instead. Diet pills, illegal drugs to curb my appetite, which was stupid because I was never eating because I was hungry anyway. But I did that for a while. I mean, I just spent so much money and just unbelievable amounts of time trying to figure this out and nothing worked. Towards the end of my 20s, there was really no break in between my binging. I was not able to just do it once a day. I was basically just rolling out of bed and binging on the way to work and just eating all day long. And I was not hiding it. I was stealing food from work as an adult. I wasn't hiding it from my coworkers or anything. Like I was just constantly eating a lot. I was gaining weight so rapidly that I couldn't keep up like with my clothes. I was always running out of money because I never had clothes that fit. I remember like going to the doctor and them being like, "Oh, we just saw you and you gained like such and such amount of weight in such a short amount of time." So I was like really, really out of control. There was no break in between my binging towards the end. That is when I checked myself into an eating disorder like treatment center. It was a hospital. So I wanted to be a patient, like an inpatient, and I qualified for that, but I couldn't take off work. So I was in their outpatient program. It was called intensive outpatient program. And I had to borrow money from my parents, because insurance didn't cover it. This was like still is, a very famous, like nationally, it might be have been like the first in the country or something. I'm not sure. But it's like an eating disorder center. And it just happened to be fairly close to where I was living. So I knew about it and I knew people who had gone, but I also knew that like it was expensive and that, I can't take off work and I can't just like quit my job. But I was always kind of in the back of my mind of like, if things get really, really bad, I can go to this center, this hospital. So I started their program and, it was a really big deal. I told my partner, like, this is it. Because by this point, I wasn't hiding it. Everyone knew I had a real problem. And so I told my partner, like, this is going to change my life. I remember, like, crying to my best friend on the phone, like, this is it. I'm finally doing it. Enough is enough. And I basically had a whole team of experts trying to get me to stop compulsively eating. So I had group therapy there. I had individual therapy. I would eat meals there. And then I had to like track what I was eating when I wasn't there. My husband had to come to like an informational session. I mean, it was a really, really big deal. It was like a couple months long, and I completed the program, and, I was no better off. And that was when I just felt just so scared, because this was always in the back of my mind of like what I could do as a last resort. And these people were experts, so if they can't help me, what am I going to do? And so, of course, very shortly after I completed this program and I was feeling terrified and, just beyond hopeless, a family member told me about a 12-step program for compulsive eating. She was like really liking it. And, at this point, I was like, I'll try anything. So, of course, it took me a while to go to my first meeting. But I finally went, and again, I'm not hiding it. I'm telling people like this is what I'm doing. I'm trying anything. So I started going to face-to-face meetings in my area. I was going to the same meetings twice a week and getting to know people there. I would offer to lead the meeting, and I would share, and I would listen to people share. I was doing it. I was fully participating in the meetings, and I was going to meetings twice a week. But, nothing was changing. So then I decided, okay, well, I should get a sponsor. At the meetings that I was going to, there were almost no sponsors. Like when it was time to say, like, okay, who's available to sponsor, like nobody, even though they were well attended, nobody was a sponsor except for this one person, this one lady. She was always at the meetings that I was at. And she would always, start by saying that she had been abstinent for like 23 years or something. And she was an available sponsor, but I didn't want her to sponsor me because whenever she would share, which was like at every meeting, she was always talking about what she could and couldn't eat. And she seemed very unhappy. She seemed like she was still totally obsessed with food. I didn't want that. Like, that's what I was trying to get out of. I didn't want to be obsessed with eating and not eating and what can I eat and not eat and blah, blah, blah. I turned to some 12-step meetings on the phone, and I got a sponsor. And this sponsor took me through the steps quickly, but I was not willing to really do anything. I was willing to set aside like an hour a day max for a meeting, but I really didn't want to do any work. And of course, this is all subconscious. I was definitely not honest. I was really, not doing what the program tells us to do and what she was telling me to do. So of course, nothing was changing, but I told myself that it was my sponsor's fault, that she wasn't the right sponsor for me. I basically wanted someone to just tell me what I wanted to hear. I didn't really want to do any work. And so, this continued on for a while, where I was still going to meetings, but I wasn't working the steps. And, I was just kind of in a weird spot. Then, and there's a lot to it, but just in the interest of time, eventually I got another sponsor. And this time I was honest when she took me through the steps. And I was willing to do more work. And so I stopped binging, which was miraculous. I hadn't been able to do that since I was a child, but I was still not doing the program, 100%. And again, this is all subconscious, but, I didn't want to, like, if a meeting was too late, I didn't want to stay up late for it. Or, I didn't want to do like wind up, but I was willing to share on the phone, just little things. I wasn't really 10th stepping. Sometimes I was, not always. It definitely wasn't program wasn't my top priority, I think is a good way to put it. I was doing it and it was a priority, but it wasn't my top priority. So eventually, this sponsor left, and then I had her sponsor, and then she left, and then I had her sponsor. And so I kind of just happened to be moving through sponsors because people were leaving. And I ended up getting a sponsor that is very knowledgeable, really, really strong recovery. And she let me go. She was like, I can't put my finger on it, but there's something that you're not doing because if you were doing this program 100%, you would feel happy, joyous, and free. And I wasn't. So I was out of program for a couple of months. And I was devastated. It was like the worst thing that could have possibly happened was being let go by my sponsor. That was just like the worst case scenario because I had definitely made program, my higher power, basically, instead of my program connecting me to my higher power, I was like making program my higher power, if that makes sense. So being let go was like the worst thing that could have happened. But of course, it ended up being the best thing that had happened because when I came back into program after being out for a couple of months, I was so grateful for the 12-step program that things didn't feel like a chore. It was like I was just so thankful that the 12-step way of life was there for me and available. I had a new attitude around it. My recovery, has definitely had ups and downs. When I am working my program to the best of my ability, it's like nothing else. I mean, one thing that's really incredible to me is like in recovery, not having a desire to binge. I did not understand, or I didn't really think that would be possible. I thought that I would be able to stop binging, but that I would always want to. And what I found in recovery that is just so miraculous is like I don't have a desire to binge, which is just unbelievable to me. I never really thought that would be possible. I am able to have a fuller, richer life. I also think of recovery as just granting me so much clarity. When I have a thought that is, selfish or, self-obsessed, I'm able to really see that. And I was not able to see that before. So I feel like being in recovery has just given me an ability to see life in a way that I did not see it before. I'm still learning, I'm still growing, but I can honestly say that I just feel so thankful that I am a compulsive eater, that I get to live this way of life, that I just have such a gratitude for being a chronic compulsive eater because it allows me to live this 12-step way of life, which I just think is such a incredible, beautiful, amazing, freeing, peaceful, wonderful way to live. It just works. It just works. And I tried everything and I just think it's really miraculous that this program exists and I'm just incredibly thankful. I have chosen a passage that resonates with my recovery on page 87, very last paragraph there. As we go through the day, we pause when agitated or doubtful and ask for the next right thought or action. We constantly remind ourselves we are no longer running the show, humbly saying to ourselves many times each day, "Thy will be done." We are then in much less danger of excitement, fear, anger, worry, self-pity, or foolish decisions. We become much more efficient. We do not tire so easily, for we are not burning up energy foolishly as we did when we were trying to arrange light to suit ourselves. It works, it really does. We chronic compulsive eaters are undisciplined, so we let God discipline us in the simple way we have just outlined. But this is not all. There's action and more action. Faith without works is dead. So I chose this for a lot of reasons. One, just this listing out here, excitement, fear, anger, worry, self-pity, and foolish decisions, that really summed up my life prior to recovery. I was really like on high highs or low lows. I was very afraid, although I didn't realize that I was experiencing a lot of fear. I was extremely worried. I had a ton of self-pity, and I was very irresponsible in all aspects of my life. So I was always making foolish decisions. And then this just idea of being more efficient and not tiring so easily. I just remember before I got recovered being tired all the time. And I think it was just because, I mean, physically, I wasn't treating my body the right way. But also just mentally, I was so tired because constantly thinking about yourself and what you look like and what other people look like, it's just so draining and mentally exhausting. And I have found in recovery that I just have energy that I never realized was even possible to have. And I think it's because I'm not burning up that energy like they're saying here, just constantly thinking about myself. I also chose this passage because I used to think before I came into program that, I was just a lazy person and undisciplined, and that was just how I was. And so if I could just become disciplined, then I would be fine. And I love how it says that we chronic compulsive eaters are undisciplined. Like that's true, but that doesn't need to be like the end. It says, okay, that's true. So what we do is we let our higher power discipline us. So, we do that by working the 12 steps. And I just think that is so freeing and comforting that we don't have to find an inner will or find discipline or tap into something. We can just let our higher power do that for us. And I think as I continue to grow in my recovery, really understanding that I don't need to be so worried all the time, that there is like where I am is where I am, and all I need to do is just try. And I don't need to be constantly thinking in the future, or like thinking in black and white, because that burns up energy, like they're talking about here. But rather, I can be undisciplined and I can just let God take care of it. And so that includes everything, every aspect of my life. And so I just love that idea of like, we're undisciplined and we let God discipline us. So I'm going to leave my contact information. Again, my name is Carolyn. I am located in New Jersey. That is Eastern Time. My phone number is 302-379-6373. You can call or text, and I also have WhatsApp.
Hey, it's Kat. Hey, I actually have a kind of a comment, then it becomes a question, and then I have a second question, but I'll let someone else have a chance first so that in case there's anyone else. But yeah, so the comment, just I really like what you were talking about when your sponsor let you go because there was just like something missing about like being happy, joyous, and free. And I found a lot of times people can read that and they think that that means like, hey, I should be happy all the time. I should always have a smile on my face, even if, I'm getting kicked around, I should just be like, yay. Or if my child's being crazy during a meeting, I should be like, it's cool. Everything's fine. So yeah, and I'm saying that just to be ironic, by the way. Um, but yeah, the needless to say is that I guess could you describe a little bit about what it means for you to be happy, joyous, and free? Because I think sometimes the perfectionism in us comes out, and then we're like, I'm not happy, I'm doing something wrong, and sometimes we can propel ourselves. Versus like, what does happy, joyous, and free like look like in your recovery?
Yeah, that is a great question and a great comment. I think it's a little bit hard to explain. So I will say that. But I feel like in recovery now, I feel like I will get upset about something for a legitimate reason, or I will feel, sick and, I'm upset that I'm sick, or I'm disappointed, or I'm worried about, my child's health, for example, like a legitimate reason. But I feel that feeling, and then I'm able to, it doesn't disappear, but it's just not as strong, if that makes sense. Like I'm able to say, like, okay, this is concerning, this is upsetting, I'm worried. Obviously, I work a 10th step, um, but I don't feel the low lows that I felt outside of recovery of like, um, I don't have that low just depth of despair feeling anymore. Even when really bad things happen, I just feel like I know I'm worried and it's okay to be worried, but I also know that God is going to handle it. So that's how I would answer that.
It's super helpful. Thank you.
Caroline, thanks so much for sharing. It was, I just, there's so much that resounds for me. And I think I'm so glad for the peace and sanity of recovery. Thanks for sharing that passage as well. It's so beautiful. I was curious when you say that like you're working your program, maybe if you could highlight one or two things that you feel like have made the difference. I hear from the passage that you chose, like that ability to stop and ask, what's the next right step? But I was just curious if there was one or two things that you could highlight that say that those are your kind of go-to recovery tools.
Well, the one thing that I struggle with still, that I am growing in is my 11th step, like setting aside a legit amount of time in the morning, and for me doing a guided meditation because I'm not really great with meditating without a guide. It is like really uncanny how that just makes me feel so much better. And I think part of that is the guilt. If I don't do that in the morning, like if I'm rushing through my morning meditation, the kids woke me up or whatever, then I just have this like lingering sense of guilt of like, oh, I didn't do that right. And then that kind of just like colors my day. But if I do like really try, because I mean, all in my mind, all I can do is just try to do, a guided meditation. Again, this is just for me personally. Then I feel like my whole day is just so much better because I feel like I started the day, I did the right thing, I tried, even if my mind wanders, like at least I tried and I set that time aside. So that is something that I'm still really working on. But when I do it the way that I should, it just makes me feel so much better. And then also kind of, like an obvious answer is wind up. So like when things are difficult, if you have like a life event, like maybe you lose your job or you're looking for another job or your kid is sick or something like that, I think that wind up is in-person wind up is always like really, really helpful. And again, I feel like a part of it is just like because you're doing the right thing. So then that just, for me, like that just makes me feel better.
Thank you.
I can ask my second question real quick, and if you have time, but if you need to get off, because I know you need to get your kids to bed.
No, 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 they're fine. They're doing well.
Yeah. So, you talked a lot in your story, at least I feel like the theme that I heard resonated was there was a lot of dishonesty. When I say that, I mean is there was a lot of like you lying to yourself or you're not really seeing clearly or seeing the truth about yourself and your behaviors. So how do you think that's changed since coming into recovery? Like, do you feel like you're just more aware of your dishonesty or you can see it quicker? Or like, what tools or steps do you do when you recognize your dishonesty and like to help move forward from it?
I think that is it, is seeing it and recognizing it. And I really think it relates to when the big book talks about how like you're growing and understanding, and in the beginning, like you don't really have those intuitive thoughts, but as you get stronger in recovery, like I feel like more in tune with sort of like my God consciousness, as they say. So I think I feel more connected to that, and so then I can see my dishonesty. It's also, I think, like a real gift to be able to see my part. Um, I think that is just like such a huge miracle of recovery, is like um just being able to see really clearly, like I'm upset with this person or this person's bothering me. But I find in recovery, it's always so obvious to me what my part is. Um, and I think if I wasn't in program, that would probably be like, oh, well, that sounds like you're just beating yourself up. But I don't see it that way at all. Um, so yeah, I guess I think just like being able to see it very, very clearly is a real gift.
Thanks so much.